And I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches to the infallible mind. The divided brain, so it's a bit of a neuroscientific take, some things on psychological development, and then something called the inability to mentalize, which is a series of clinical observations. So this is our brain, and it's divided for a reason. A lot of people know it's divided, but don't think about the reason. Our spleen doesn't seem to be divided. Not every organ, our stomach is not divided in this way. Not every organ appears to be symmetrical and divided. And the divided brain isn't about language being on one side and creativity on the other. That was a simplification that came out of the 60s. There's little bits of truth to it, but it's far too simplified. But there are actually some very, very significant differences between the 2 sides of the brain. And the person who put this together is Dr. Ian McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist. He's an outstanding intellect. I mean, he was a great student of literature as well. And this is his book, The Master and His Emissary. Now, if you look at this is looking at the brain from below. So you don't usually do that, I understand, but if you were underneath a brain and you looked at it very carefully, in fact, you would find that it's broader at the right on the front and broader on the back at the left. So, it's only very grossly that it looks like the 2 hemispheres are identical. And inside, the connections are also quite different. So, for instance, the length of the connections between cells in the right hemisphere is much longer. And it goes deep into the emotional parts of the brain and reads a lot of what's going on in the body. And the left brain connections are short. It's like they're all talking to each other. Now, one of the ways to get at the very broad difference between the left hemisphere and the right, sometimes called the left brain and the right, is imagine a bird pecking for seeds among these stones and grit. So to eat, it's got to focus very narrowly on the little seed and pick it out against the background grit. Narrow focus. But it also has to keep a wide focus and keep on the lookout for new dangers or opportunities that might come on the scene, like predators, potential mates, or other food sources. So this is more like reality. One of those birds is pecking, but it's also aware that there's another comrade bird nearby. How does it do that? The narrow focus and the wide focus are actually handled by different hemispheres of the brain. Now, this is something very neat about a bird's brain. It's wired so that, let's say, the right eye is completely processed by the left hemisphere. So human beings aren't quite like that. So everything that comes in the window of the right eye is processed in the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere does all of that narrow focus work to identify the little bits of seed. You're going to have to trust me. This is going to be relevant to political correctness. It focuses on something it already knows is of importance. So this is a big thing about the left hemisphere. It focuses on what it already knows is important, seeds. And the right hemisphere, it takes the world in as a whole. So its window to the world is the bird's left eye. So it's vigilantly searching for novelty, what's not already known, a predator or perhaps a new mate. It's looking for something new that might be of importance, but who knows what that would be. So the right hemisphere's attention is open-minded and broad-minded because it doesn't quite know what it's looking for. And these things are going on at the same time through different eyes and different hemispheres. It's not just switching back and forth. Okay, that's a bird. What about humans? Our eyes are wired slightly differently, but the right hemisphere in humans is astoundingly similar. It sees holistically. So before things are digested into parts, it takes in the whole. It seeks novelty. It seeks out the unknown and new information. And because it's holistic, it sees everything in context. It has a sustained, broad, open alertness. It sees relationships. That's about context. And very important for our discussion today, it sees individuals. It sees, if you discover a human being and you see them as a unique individual in their wholeness, not in their parts, but how they all come together, That is a right brain function. It is not abstract at all. When you meet someone else who you never met for the first time, it's a unique experience. You're not generalizing from it yet. It is the seat of empathy. It's where we learn to read facial expressions and the emotions of others and our own emotions. And because it sees context, it sees humor. Lighten up. It understands metaphor. It perceives emotional subtlety and nuance. And the left hemisphere in humans, narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. It is actually tasked by the right hemisphere when something new and important is perceived to begin to map it in fine detail. And then its maps produce isolated parts more than relationships or context. Think of that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, if you've ever taken that course, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. It identifies things by abstract labels, not context, and it works with categories of people. Categories, not individuals. So whenever people are overgeneralizing about people, it has a left hemisphere flavor. Language is interpreted differently on the left and the right. It's interpreted literally. It's humorless because there's no sense of context. It's abstract. It wrests things from their context. Abstract is from the Latin, draw away. So what do I mean? One of the things that the left hemisphere does when it makes this map of the world is it confuses the map with the world. We've all heard this, don't confuse the map with the territory. That's a really good left hemisphere thing to do. Now, where is all of this data coming from? It's coming from hundreds and hundreds of studies of patients with strokes who lose main right hemisphere function or left hemisphere function. Or we can use certain kinds of magnetic devices and apply it to the brain and shut down parts of the brain and see what the remaining hemisphere is like and then give them all sorts of cognitive tests. And we can actually inject anesthetic into certain arteries and shut down a whole hemisphere of the brain. So there's many, many ways that really thousands and thousands of scientists have gotten at this. So the map is felt, so when people have certain kinds of left hemispheric strokes, when they have certain kinds of right hemispheric strokes and they're left just with the left hemisphere, we can see how concrete people are about maps. Now, the problem is with a good map is, as good as it is the world is always changing, and maps become quickly out of date. There's a few that may not come out of, go out of date quickly, like gravity seems to be what it's always been. But the left hemisphere is kind of like that person who, when lost on a car ride, says to his spouse, "We can't be lost. It's right here on the map. We're in the right place." And he says it over and over again, even though they're not. So it's got a kind of know-it-allism, a flavor of infallibility, if you will. Let me give you an example of literal versus non-literal interpretation. Imagine I was visiting your home, and I started to break out in a sweat, and I said, it must be 90 degrees in here. Now, a literal interpretation would be, Norman has made a statement, a meteorological statement about the temperature. A non-literal interpretation would be, Norman, would you like me to open the window now? That statement takes into account the context of my statement. Its relationship to me, the speaker, and to the overall environment. It requires indirect interpretation and empathy, and these are right hemispheric attributes. So here they are, the difference. On the left, isolated, no context, no relationship, sees categories, abstraction, generalization, tends to infallibility, rigid, maps are the reality. And I would suggest to you, when there's bigotry, it's coming out of this kind of move, plus many other things, ideology, emotion, etc. But from a cognitive point, this is part of it. And the right is holistic. It sees individuals. It wants new information. Okay. Now I'm going to link some of that up loosely with some things about developmental psychology that are relevant for political correctness. I'll tie it together. This is Jean Piaget, probably the greatest developmental psychologist who ever lived. And one of the things he tried to do was describe normal cognitive development. And he got a lot of it right. A lot of it holds up very well, even cross-culturally. There are some things, and I'm into the plastic brain, as you know, that can happen slightly differently in other places. But he made very, very broad observations after years and years of very fine, detailed work. So here's some things he found out. There's an early cognitive stage from 2 to 7 where children don't understand logic, and they have a lot of magical thinking. They have a limited sense that they have a mind that is perceiving the world from a particular point of view. In fact, some of them probably don't have any sense of that. And I'll go into that. And then there's this thing called centrism. They can only focus on one aspect of a situation at a time. And this is related to egocentrism, which is a kind of where do I fit in the world sort of concept. It's not just about selfishness. During this stage, their communication and thoughts are generally about themselves. Somewhat limited ability to see situations from another's point of view. They tend to assume that others see the world as they do. And some people can remain egocentric all their lives. And many, if not all of us, can, under great emotional pressure or physical illness, regress and show signs of egocentrism that we normally don't. Now, why are children egocentric? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. But one very simple reason that's hard to get out of your head once you get it in your head is this. Children at this age are quite cognitively focused on the external physical world, which can be observed, and what they can observe of the social world. But our internal mental states are not directly observable, period. So the young child rarely has a concept of mental states or the mind. This means there's a kind of mind blindness, limited awareness that other people have minds, and more importantly, there is a limited awareness that they themselves have an invisible mind that is interpreting reality. And each of you try to remember that moment in your life, if you can, when you realized, actually, this is me processing all of this. I remember I was at nursery school, and I was looking, no divinity spoke to me at the time that I'm aware of. I was looking at some sticks. And I was just ripe, and I realized I'm looking at those sticks, and other people aren't seeing those sticks. And somehow or other, it's self-consciousness, self-awareness, and the awareness that I had a mind, and that therefore other people had minds, crystallized at that moment for me. And each of you probably had that experience. Do any of you remember that? Now, what happens if you're not aware that you have a mind that's processing everything? Your subjective experience of events seems like the only reality. You are not aware that your experience is just your take on events, that it might be a misinterpretation, a false belief, or a product of your experience. Interpretations are often centered on the self. Think of the child whose parents are getting divorced who thinks, it's my fault, it must be my fault. That's egocentrism. Now, we gradually grow out of it. The next stage, from 7 to 11, shows the beginning of new brain maturation. The child begins to use inductive logic, becomes aware of the existence of other minds. And this can often happen when they realize that you can fool people, that people can have false beliefs. And so Piaget did experiments on this. But for there to be a false belief means that there's got to be an internal mental process in the person who has the false belief that can be misled or mistaken, is somehow different, is processing events. And then development proceeds and abstract reasoning kicks in. Children can think logically. In language, they don't take everything literally. And children always love stories. But at this point in time, they can begin to analyze the literature and get much more deeply into the minds of the characters. So they're mentalizing, the ability to appreciate that one has a mind that interprets reality and that other people have such a mind. When you mentalize well, you don't even know you're doing it. It's automatic. It's unconscious. we realize, too, that we make inferences about reality all the time and are prone to error. We realize that the mental states of other people change rapidly, and the only sensible way to know what they are feeling is to inquire or to take a curious stance. If Socrates was the smartest man in ancient Greece, why did he spend all of his time talking to other people who were arguably his inferiors much of the time? It's because there's something motoric about thinking and learning, and that's why dialogue is a very important thing. So you can say, you know, I'd be pretty good in a totalitarian regime. I'm very independently minded. I would just keep my mouth shut, and if there was no freedom of speech, I'd never express myself. And that might work. And also, you might get very, very sick. You might get sick because it might be that if thinking is so important to you, then expressing it and interacting with people about it might just be the thing you need, the way, you know, some of us need to breathe air. So when we mentalize well, we can focus on others. We can form stable relationships. This is all the opposite of the infallible frame of mind. Now, I want to talk about the absence of mentalization in adults, not in kids. There are many situations where we lose awareness that we have a mind interpreting reality. As I said, high states of stress and emotion. And some people never develop the ability to mentalize in the first place. And some have mental illnesses that make it hard to mentalize or to think or imagine. If you're trapped in a very intense delusion, you are probably not mentalizing. One of the things we've learned we've learned a lot about mentalizing and its absence by studying the autistic spectrum. And for a number of autistic children, it's very, very difficult. You can be very high on the spectrum and have difficulty reading emotions and mentalizing other minds. In fact, the term mindblindness came out of the literature on autism. And children with autism are teased mercilessly, as you know, it's awful. And imagine what it's like for them not being able to understand other minds when kids are teasing them when they miss things. And then they will also misinterpret teasing or things that were very gentle remarks not meant to tease a child if you can't mentalize. So it's a terrible trap. There's another thing that happens where people arguably can mentalize, but they don't, and that's in extreme forms of narcissism. So what the narcissist does is just imagine I'm a big narcissist. What I do is, and I'm dealing with you, I take all of my negative qualities and I attribute to them, to you rather. I keep all my good qualities, so now I'm very pure. But I don't stop there. Then I plagiarize all your special qualities and think they're mine. So if you're in a meeting with a narcissist, you come up with a great idea. He says, "What a great meeting. I can't believe I came up with that idea." You know? So imagine you're in a knowledge culture or in a situation where knowledge is important, or in an ethnic group where knowledge is important, and you can get a lot of narcissistic know-it-allism going on, right? People who never form close, secure attachments with others to help them read their feelings will have difficulty mentalizing. And there's a lot of psychiatric conditions where people have grown up without that input. There was nothing malign. The parents may have had difficulty reading emotions, but then the child has difficulty reading emotions and difficulty mentalizing. But you can see there are just many different causes of mentalizing. And so I've said that in autism, there's often a lot of right hemispheric damage. That helps to explain some of the mentalizing problems. But in very high trauma, in PTSD, for instance, we now know that the right hemisphere, parts of it actually go offline. They stop processing. And remember, that's the hemisphere that helps you pay attention to novelty. So you're stuck in a trauma. You're reliving it over and over again. You're in a new situation, but you can't even notice the new situation. And a lot of your feelings and your cognition is cut down, and you can't even read emotion properly. We need to be able to read emotion to read minds. When we can't mentalize, our mental reality becomes the outer reality. They're equivalent. They're isomorphic. Our internal world has all the power of the external world, and all our thoughts feel real and as vivid as intense sensory experience. We can be terrified by our own mental experience, therefore. It's so vivid, and we lack the normal ways of reassuring ourselves, such as saying, I'm just imagining this, or it might not happen. That doesn't happen. It's all real. So our negative thoughts about ourselves and others feel totally unalterable. They're set in concrete. And remember, you don't have to be mentally ill to experience this kind of thing. Any of us can slip into non-mentalizing in extreme situations. And we become mind blind. How does that play out, though? We become intolerant of alternative perspectives. We are humorless. We are predisposed to massive generalizations and speak in absolute terms. Men are always, women are always. We understand language literally and often misunderstand nuance. And so we tend to misinterpret others. This is important because we can't read them. We see them as malevolent, and we start blaming and fault-finding, and we get angry. There's rigidity and external focus when you don't have an internal life. We're prone to all or nothing thinking. Our thought processes rigidify. We stick to the first explanation that occurs to us. Think about all the arguments you know, where someone makes a silly first explanation and then they dig into it. So there's a tendency to rigid quasi-infallibility and little awareness of how our behavior is impacting others. We're not mentalizing. This is really important now. Unable to perceive our internal states as internal, we focus on externals, such as school, government, the job, the neighbor, and what others say. And this causes a great problem for us. We become thin-skinned because when we're over-focused on externals and what others say, and we're unable to step back and reflect, our self-esteem regulation becomes a prisoner of what others think. When we don't mentalize, we become hyper-responsive to even the most benign criticism. We are trapped in what we perceive as their point of view about us, and critical words or disagreement can feel like violence because we're so sensitive, and that's why people say, you're invalidating my existence. So to summarize this psychological brain material, 4 things contribute to moving towards a state where we don't learn or recognize our other points of view and tend toward the infallible frame of mind. Regression to earlier states of functioning under pressure, a reliance on left brain categorization, generalization, taking things out of context. And I can tell you, I could teach a person to become left-brained. I could take any number of ideologies and train them to become left-brained and turn off their right brain functioning. Then we can have mind blindness for a variety of causes. And as a reminder, George Eliot showed anger makes us feel divine justice is on our side. So all the wisdom of the gods is with us when we are angry.